Welcome to the annual public workshop for the Songs Wetland Mitigation Project. My name is Mark Page. I'm one of the lead scientists on the project. The other lead scientists are Drs. Dan Reed, raise your hand, Kat Beheshti, and Rachel Smith. We have three presentations for you today. The first, I'll be giving you a brief introduction and overview, and this will be followed by Rachel Smith presenting the results from the 2024 performance monitoring of the San Dieguito Wetlands Restoration Project. And then Kat Beheshti will be speaking on the causes and consequences of tidal creek loss at San Dieguito Wetlands. And then we'll conclude the three presentations with a general discussion and Q&A period. So now I'll provide a brief introduction to the project. And this begins with a shout out to our scientific and technical staff. These folks work both on the wetland mitigation project and on the reef mitigation project, which is the other major component of the overall mitigation monitoring program. These folks collect the data that we'll be talking about today. I'd like to also acknowledge our science advisory panel, Drs. Rich Ambrose, who's in the audience today, as well as Dr. Rush Schmidt, and Pete Ramundi is joining us via Zoom. We also have representatives from Coastal Commission staff and SCE in the audience today. Well, this this map shows the location of the impact site, the Songs impact site, and San Dieguito Lagoon, which is the site of the San Dieguito Wetlands Restoration Project, located adjacent to the city of Del Mar, about 20 miles or so north of San Diego. Well, it's useful to review the purpose and rationale behind the Songs wetland restoration projects. The Songs reactors were cooled by a single pass seawater system. Units 2 and 3 had separate intake lines. Cooling water is pumped into the plant and heated to about 19 degrees Fahrenheit or so above ambient before it was discharged offshore through a system of diffusers. It was found that power plant heated cooling water and turbulence killed fish eggs, immature fish, and fish larvae. And these operations, the Songs operations, were projected to cause substantial reductions in the populations of adult fish, adult nearshore fish in the Southern California Bight. Well, the California Coastal Act requires mitigation for impacts to the marine environment, and the California Coastal Commission is responsible for implementing the Coastal Act. So it's mitigation for the impacts to larval and juvenile fish caused by Songs operations. The Coastal Commission required SCE to create or substantially restore a minimum of 150 acres of wetlands, excluding the buffer zone and upland transition areas, and provide funding, and this is important, provide funding for scientific oversight and monitoring of the restoration project that is independent of SCE.
So I'm trying to get this off. It's not pressing.
Well, there it goes. Okay. So, but now it's not advancing. I can do this, maybe. Oh, good. There we go. Okay, this slide just summarizes key elements of the Songs Wetland Mitigation Project. First of all, it's out of kind of compensation for in-plant losses to juvenile fish caused by the operation of Songs Units 2 and 3. Physical and biological performance standards were established to evaluate the performance of the restoration project to ensure that the project produces a wetland that provides similar ecosystem functions to other wetlands in the region. 1 year of mitigation credit is given for each year that the San Dieguito Wetlands Project meets the performance standards, and lastly, fulfillment of the song's wetland mitigation requirement occurs when the number of years of mitigation credit accrued by the project equals the 32 total years of operation of units 2 and 3. Well, during about 15 years ago or so, during the initial development of the monitoring plan, we had to select reference sites with which to compare the performance, the success of the restoration project to. The criteria for the selection of, we reviewed 46 sites, and we evaluated them based on criteria that were provided in the song's permit. And these, the permit requires that the reference wetlands be relatively undisturbed, tidal, and located in the Southern California Bight. And so going through these 43 sites, we ended up selecting 3 wetlands that best met these criteria, and they are Carpenter Salt Marsh, Magoo Lagoon, and Tijuana Estuary. Unfortunately, in 2023, one of our sites, Tijuana Estuary, received record transboundary flows of sewage, which rendered the site inappropriate as a reference site. As a result of that, we had to come up with another reference site to replace Tijuana Estuary. Very, very unfortunate. So after considering our options, we selected Los Penasquitos Lagoon as best meeting the criteria provided in the coastal development permit. So back when we were putting the monitoring plan together over a decade ago, 15 years or so, Los Penasquitos we considered Los Penasquitos as a possible reference site, but at that time, the inlet was intermittently open and thus violating one of the important criteria in the song's permit. But more recently, the inlet has been maintained in an open condition and thus meets this important criteria. So now the 3 reference wetlands are Carpenter Salt Marsh, Magoo Lagoon, and Los Penasquitos Lagoon. Well, this image just shows you what the site looked like back in 2003 before the project got underway. And you can see the San Dieguito River there right in the middle, and you can see rural upland and old ag fields lying on either side of the San Dieguito River. On the lower left-hand quadrant of the image, you can see the site of an old airfield back in during World War II. It was an old blimp base. And in the lower left, you can see a portion of a basin that was constructed in the mid-1980s, which is termed the Fish and Game Basin. Well, during construction, the rural areas, the ag field areas were excavated and graded to create the habitat provided in the restoration plan, which you can see here in this image taken from Google Earth in 2016. You can also see some nesting sites. These were constructed for the lease term, but are not part of the rest of SCE's mitigation requirement. You can also see on the upper right and lower right disposal sites. And these are upland sites that receive the majority of the approximately 2.2 million cubic yards of material that was excavated during construction of the project. This slide just provides a brief timeline of events associated with the San Dieguito Wetland Restoration Project. Construction started back in 2006. Actually, most construction was completed by about 2008, but some tidal creeks were added to the module W2, W3, which you can see on the right, in the image on the right, in 2010. This area was then regraded again in 2014. There's been a vigorous planting program, particularly early on and more recently, in which early on Spartina cordgrass was planted throughout the lower elevation portions of the restoration project. and other plant species were planted primarily at higher elevations. This planting program has continued through 2024, and the planting program has become a little more broad, including some of the middle elevations as well. The inlet has been dredged approximately every 2 to 3 years to keep it open, which is a requirement of the permit that the inlet be continuously open to tidal exchange. And performance monitoring began in January of 2012 and continues to the present. The slide just summarizes the monitoring, what's going on with the monitoring program at San Dieguito Wetlands. And that is that annual monitoring is required to evaluate the physical and biological performance standards provided in the SONGS permit. I think importantly also, the monitoring tracks ecosystem development and identifies adaptive management opportunities pertaining to the physical and biological functioning of the wetland. And there have been several examples of this during the construction and monitoring of this project. Independent monitoring is conducted by scientists from UC Santa Barbara with advice from our science advisory panel. Now, I'd like to conclude just to let you know about the website if you aren't already aware of it. Basically, this can be found using the link at the top of the slide. You can also type in keywords into your browser, like UCSB songs. You might get, yeah, I might actually get some songs, UCSB songs. So if you put in UCSB MSI songs, you'll get to it for sure. This website is a great resource, provides more information on the impacts of SONGS operations and the monitoring program in general. It has a library that you can access various documents, for example, the monitoring plan, the restoration plan, various presentations that we've given, the wetland workshop presentations. And I should mention that this is not just for the wetland side of things, it also includes the reef side of things. You can also, we also have annual reports each year for both the wetland and the reef that you can access on this website. And finally, all our data are publicly available. So our data are made available through the National Science Foundation's Environmental Data Initiative, or EDI, and you can find the portal on our website to access these data. So with that, I'll turn the podium over to Rachel, who will present the results from the performance monitoring in 2024.
Great, thank you, Mark. Oh, too quick. Okay. Good morning. I'm excited to talk to you about the performance of the San Dieguito Wetland Restoration Project. And in this talk, I'll be reporting on the results from our 13th year of performance monitoring and our evaluation of the project progress towards meeting those performance standards that are required for successful mitigation. So I'm going to begin by defining the two types of standards that we use to assess wetland performance. Beginning with the absolute performance standards. And these are standards that we only evaluate within the restored San Dieguito wetland, and all of these absolute standards must be met each year. And we evaluate those standards based on just the value for the current year. So now I'm going to walk through the results for each of those five absolute standards, beginning with tidal prism. So tidal prism is the volume of water that's exchanged in an estuary between the low and high tide levels, and it's a metric of tidal flushing, salt marsh inundation, and inlet stability. And the tidal prism standard specifies that the tidal prism of San Dieguito wetlands shall be maintained. And so the tidal prism standard, as you can see here by the green boxes, has been met every year since monitoring began, including in 2024. The topography standard requires that the wetland not undergo any major topographic degradation, such as excessive erosion or sedimentation. And similarly to tidal prism, the topography standard has also been met since monitoring began, including in 2024. Now move on to the plant reproduction standard, which requires that 7 common salt marsh plant species demonstrate reproduction at least once every 3 years. And again, this standard has been met every year since monitoring began, including in 2024. We now move on to the exotic species standard, which requires that the important functions of the wetland not be impaired by exotic species that can have negative impacts on wetland functioning, for example, by altering food webs or changing the physical habitat structure. And this standard has also been met since monitoring began, including for this year. Now moving on to the habitat areas standard. This standard specifies that wetland habitat areas shall not vary by more than 10% from the acreages that are outlined in the final restoration plan, which is shown here on the right by the acreages for salt marsh, mudflat, and subtidal habitat. And so this standard is really designed to preserve the mix of habitats that were provided in the final restoration plan and to guard against large-scale habitat conversions, for example, from salt marsh to mudflat or vice versa. And so this standard has yet to be met, and so we're going to examine it in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to begin by providing an overview of some of the definitions of how we classify each habitat type, beginning with subtidal habitat. And so we classify a habitat as subtidal if it's continuously submerged and at elevations less than minus 0.9 feet NGVD. We classify habitat as mudflat if it is intertidal and at less than or equal to elevations of 3.5 feet NGVD, and also have vegetation cover less than 5%. So for example, in this photo on the right, the unvegetated area on the left would be classified as mudflat, but the unvegetated area on the right would not, because it's at an elevation that's too high to be considered mudflat. Habitat is classified as salt marsh if the area is intertidal and at less than or equal to 4.5 feet NGVD, and also has at least 30% cover of vegetation, which we evaluate with aerial imagery. And then lastly, there's other habitat, which was not a planned habitat type, and it was not included in the final restoration plan. But this was a category that was defined after monitoring began, and it includes areas that are intertidal and less than or equal to 4.5 feet NGVD with less than 30% vegetation cover. So for example, in this photo on the right, this area is too sparsely vegetated to be considered salt marsh, but it's also too densely vegetated to be considered mudflat and is also at too high of an elevation. And so we're now showing the results for 2024 by including the what the planned acres are for each habitat type plus or minus 10% of that area to give you the range of what those planned acres are, and then the results for 2024. And so you can see that subtidal and salt marsh habitat areas were within the 10% of the planned acreages for 2024, but that the area of mudflat was less than 10% of that minimum required acreage of 22.4 acres at only 13.6 acres. And so looking at the trend in habitat areas over time, we can see that the salt marsh acreage has continued to increase over time, and it now exceeds the planned acreage of this habitat type. And that's due to natural colonization of salt marsh plants in combination with the success of Southern California Edison's planting program. Those have both contributed to the increase in salt marsh area, particularly in recent years. In contrast, the area of mudflat has been decreasing over time, particularly in the last 5 years, and it's currently 8.8 acres short of that minimum required area of 22.4 acres. And loss of mudflat habitat has been driven by salt marsh encroachment into these habitat types. So on the top, we have an aerial image of the mudflat area, and the arrows are showing the edges of the salt marsh expansion around the outside of the planned mudflat areas. And in particular, you can see these green circles that are these marsh cordgrass clones that are expanding into those planned mudflat areas. And salt marsh encroachment also operates in kind of a positive feedback where established vegetation drives additional sediment accretion, which then further facilitates mudflat conversion to salt marsh. And so now moving on to those other habitat areas, you can see that subtidal habitat has been relatively consistent over time, and it's really promising also to see this decline in other habitat. And so at this point in the project, most of this other habitat is actually at higher elevations that can only convert to salt marsh, not to mudflat. And so moving on from the absolute standards, we can now focus on the relative standards, which are standards that compare the restored wetlands to natural reference sites. And so to earn mitigation credit for a given year, the proportion of relative standards met at the restored wetland must equal or exceed the lowest performing reference wetland. And the evaluation of each relative standard is based on a 4-year running average to account for natural fluctuations over time. And so we measure the restored wetland relative to reference wetlands because the goal is for the restored wetland to be similar to the reference wetlands. And so here, similar means that the 4-year running average for a relative standard at San Dieguito wetlands is equal to or exceeds the lowest performing reference wetland. And so as Mark mentioned in his talk, we recently moved to Los Penasquitos Lagoon and to replace Tijuana Estuary. And so for standards where we only have 1 year of data available for Los Penasquitos Lagoon, we use the 2024 data for all wetlands. However, where a full year of data was not available for Los Penasquitos in 2024, we excluded this site and from evaluation and just used the 4-year running average for the remaining 3 wetlands. And so to sum up, again, San Dieguito is considered to be similar to reference wetlands if the proportion of relative standards met at San Dieguito equals or exceeds the lowest performing reference wetland. So here's a list of the 15 relative standards that we use to evaluate the success of San Dieguito wetlands. And these include standards related to water quality, vegetation and algal cover, birds, fish, and invertebrates. And we measure both fish and invertebrate density and richness in both main channel and tidal creek habitats. And here richness is referring to the number of species. And so this table gives an overview of the outcomes for the relative performance standards at San Dieguito over the last 10 years. So you can see that some standards have consistently been met. There's other standards that have never been met or have been intermittently met over time. However, overall, there's been a general improvement across all standards over time. And so now we're going to focus just on the results for the relative standards for 2024, beginning with water quality. And so we measure water quality with continuous water loggers as shown in these photos on the right, and we compare the mean sequential hours of hypoxia, which is when dissolved oxygen levels are less than 3 parts per million. And so for this standard, the lower values are actually more desirable, as shown by this arrow on the left. And so in this and in the following figures, San Dieguito wetlands is going to be in brown, and then the other 3 reference wetlands are going to be in this lighter green. And so if we look at this table in the upper right-hand corner, we can see that San Dieguito has consistently met this standard for the last 10 years, including in 2024, and all of the wetlands, including San Dieguito, passed this standard for this year. Now moving on to vegetation cover. The vegetation cover standard uses aerial imagery, as you can see on the right, to assess the percent cover of salt marsh that's greater than 30% cover. And so this standard has not yet been met, and San Dieguito did fail the standard in 2024. And so to better understand this underperformance, we can examine the annual time series for vegetation cover. So vegetation cover has generally increased over time, and particularly in the last 2 years, there's been a substantial increase in vegetation cover at San Dieguito, and it's really just below the annual value for Carpentria salt marsh. And so vegetation cover at San Dieguito is really on a promising trajectory. And given that this increasing trend has been consistent over time, we do expect that it will likely intercept the values for the reference wetlands very soon. Now looking at the results for algal cover, the algal cover standard is another standard that uses aerial imagery in its evaluation. And excessive algal growth can affect wetland structure and function through negative impacts on vegetation, invertebrates, bird feeding, and water quality. And so this is another standard where higher values of algal cover are actually less desirable, as you can see by this arrow on the left. And so San Dieguito has consistently met this standard over the last 10 years, and we saw a continuation of this pattern in 2024 with San Dieguito meeting this standard as the algal cover was lower than at the lowest performing reference wetland, which was Magoo Lagoon, which had high algal cover. We now move on to Spartina canopy architecture. And this is a standard that's meant to assess the capacity for Spartina to provide habitat for ridgeways, rail, and other bird species. And so for this standard, we measure the proportion of Spartina stems that are greater than 3 feet tall. And San Dieguito has consistently met the Spartina standard for the last 10 years. And this pattern, again, continued in 2024 with San Dieguito meeting this standard, as Spartina canopy was greater than at the lowest performing reference wetland, which was Magoo Lagoon. So now we move on to the bird standards, beginning with bird density. And so we did not include Los Penasquitos Lagoon as a reference site for the bird standards in 2024 because we did not have a full year of bird data collected at this lagoon. And so for these bird standards, we're going to exclude this lagoon and just use the 4-year running average for the remaining 3 wetlands. And so bird density has consistently been met at San Dieguito for the last 10 years, and except for in 2019. And this pattern continued in 2024 with San Dieguito passing the standard for this year with a comparable bird density to Carpinteria Salt Marsh. Bird densities were substantially higher at Magoo Lagoon. Moving on to bird richness, this is another standard that has been consistently met at San Dieguito over time. And as in prior years, San Dieguito met this standard in 2024 with the highest value for bird richness relative to the other wetlands. Next, moving on to food chain support to birds. This is a standard that has chronically underperformed at San Dieguito relative to the reference wetlands since 2017. And this pattern continued in 2024, and food chain support was lowest at San Dieguito in 2024. And so to better understand this underperformance, at San Dieguito, we'll look at the full annual time series for food chain support to birds. So across all years, food chain support to birds has been consistently highest at Magoo Lagoon, and at San Dieguito, the average density of feeding birds declined after 2014 and has remained just below Carpinteria Salt Marsh over time. Although we did see a slight increase in the density of feeding birds in 2024 at San Dieguito, the 4-year running average at San Dieguito still remains below that of Carpinteria. So now we move on to those standards that are measured in main channel habitats, beginning with fish density and richness. And so these standards have been intermittently met over time, though San Dieguito has passed these standards for the last few years. And so in 2024, San Dieguito passed both fish standards in main channel habitats, and all wetlands passed these standards for this year. Now looking at invertebrate density and richness in main channel habitats. Invertebrate density in main channel habitats had not been met at San Dieguito until this year, and this standard has been one that's been on a positive trajectory over the last few years. In contrast, invertebrate richness in main channel habitats has been consistently met at San Dieguito over the last 10 years, and that there was no exception this year with San Dieguito passing this standard for this year. So all of the wetlands actually passed the standards for both fish and invertebrate density and richness in main channel habitats in 2024. Now moving on to those standards that we measure in tidal creek habitats, beginning with fish density and richness. These standards have been intermittently met over time, though San Dieguito has passed these standards over the last few years. And in 2024, San Dieguito passed both fish standards in tidal creek habitats, and all wetlands passed the standard for fish richness, though Los Penasquitos Lagoon failed the standard for fish density this year. Now moving on to invertebrate density and richness in tidal creek habitats. Invertebrate density in tidal creek habitats has never been met at San Dieguito wetland, and San Dieguito did fail this standard in 2024. In contrast, invertebrate richness in tidal creek habitats has recently been met at San Dieguito over the last few years, and this standard continued to be met in 2024. And so to better understand the underperformance of invertebrate density in tidal creeks at San Dieguito, we can again look at the annual time series for this standard. And the annual time series on the left indicates that invertebrate density at San Dieguito has remained well below the reference sites since the beginning of monitoring. There's been a slight improvement in these values over the last 2 years, but San Dieguito was still below the lowest performing reference site, Los Penasquitos Lagoon in 2024. And so the results for fish and invertebrate density in tidal creeks do reflect the fact that salt marsh encroachment into tidal creeks has required shifts in where we sample, because sampling is not possible in encroached tidal creeks. And so to match the sample size of reference sites, we really aim to sample 6 constructed tidal creeks at San Dieguito each year. But due to Spartina encroachment in 2024, it was only possible to sample 2 constructed tidal creeks, which are shown here by the white circles on the west side of the restoration project. However, over time, there's been 2 naturally formed creeks that have evolved from the frequently exposed mudflat, as shown by these donut circles on the east side of the restoration site. And in 2024, we actually also sampled these two naturally formed creeks and used them to assess compliance so that we could have a more comparable sample size to our reference sites. And so if we compare the outcomes for fish and invertebrate density and richness for the constructed creeks at San Dieguito, which are shown in brown on the left, to those that we collected in the naturally formed creeks at San Dieguito, shown by this hatched pattern, we can see that all fish and invertebrate standards except for fish density were lower in the constructed creeks relative to the naturally formed creeks. And if we then compare these to the values collected at the reference sites, it's clear that the values collected in the naturally formed creeks are more similar to those that are collected at the references. And so when we're grouping constructed and naturally formed creeks together and assessing compliance, that may mask some of the contributions of these constructed creeks, which were generally lower than the naturally formed creeks. And so, spoiler for the next talk, Kat's going to go into more detail about some of the causes and consequences of tidal creek loss at San Dieguito Wetland. And so this table summarizes the outcomes for each relative performance standard for each wetland in 2024. And so in addition to the green and red that we've been seeing before, we also have a color gray for standards that were not assessed. And so for each wetland. And so Carpinteria Salt Marsh did not fail any standards that we assessed for it in 2024. Coming in next, Los Penasquitos Lagoon failed only one standard for fish density, meaning that it met 91% of standards. Magoo Lagoon failed two standards, algal cover and Spartina canopy architecture, meaning it met 87% of standards. And then San Dieguito Wetlands failed three standards, including invertebrate density in tidal creeks, vegetation cover, and food chain support, meaning that it met 80% of standards and is the lowest performing wetland for this year. So therefore, San Dieguito did not meet the relative standards requirement for 2024. That said, if we look at a time series of the proportion of relative standards met at San Dieguito, we can see that although there was a progressive decline in the proportion of standards met beginning in 2017, since 2022, we've seen an increase in the proportion of standards met, suggesting that the project is on an upward trajectory. And this trend, it's particularly notable, this trend continued in 2024, even when Los Penasquitos Lagoon replaced Tijuana Estuary as a reference site. But overall, San Dieguito has yet to receive mitigation credit. And just as a reminder, to receive mitigation credit for a given year, the wetland restoration project must meet all of the absolute standards and then as many relative standards as the lowest performing reference wetland. And so in terms of absolute standards, the San Dieguito Wetlands has yet to meet the habitat area standard due to loss of mudflat. And in 2024, San Dieguito also failed to meet the relative performance standard requirement. And so we're currently evaluating why the wetland is not meeting certain performance standards to inform potential remediation options if required. And then we wanted to end by flagging some anticipated changes for 2025 performance monitoring. So in 2024, the additional restoration of the W6 and W19 projects within the San Dieguito Lagoon, which are shown in blue on this map, was completed. And so they are all on a common tidal inlet. And so opening these restored areas to tidal influence will require changes in how we evaluate the tidal prism standard. And we're currently in the process of updating our evaluation approach. And then, as I highlighted earlier in the talk, the loss of tidal creeks will require changes in how we evaluate fish and invertebrate relative standards, as we likely will not be able to sample any constructed creeks in 2025. But it's a perfect segue to Kat, who's going to talk more about the causes and consequences of that tidal creek loss in the next talk.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Rachel. This talk set up this next one very nicely. Okay, so like Rachel said, this next talk is on the causes and consequences of tidal creek loss at San Dieguito Wetlands. But I first want to start off by acknowledging the importance of tidal creeks as these natural features of natural wetlands, as they provide critical support for key wetland processes and functions, from marsh drainage and inundation to habitat for fishes, invertebrates, and birds, to providing support for plant richness, biomass production, as well as seed dispersal. Now, the song's coastal development permit objectives were designed to guide the restoration plan and state that the restoration should provide regionally scarce habitat, potential for local ecosystem diversity, and fish habitat, all of which tidal creeks provide. Additionally, the permit explicitly calls out tidal creeks as a suggested sampling location for assessing numerous standards. And this is reflected in our wetland monitoring plan, which was a derivative of the Songs permit. Also noteworthy that San Dieguito Lagoon historically supported tidal creeks that were later lost due to the filling of the wetland and development of the surrounding watershed. Now, in addition to the criteria that Mark outlined in the introduction talk with regards to the criteria for reference site selection, being that they be tidal, relatively undisturbed, and located within the Southern California Bight, it was also important that the reference sites possess tidal creeks. This was an important attribute because we evaluate the abundance and richness of invertebrates and fishes in tidal creek habitats at all of our monitored wetlands. And the final restoration plan included design elements typical of natural wetlands in the region, right? So salt marsh, mudflat, and subtidal habitat. It didn't include the construction of creeks per se, but rather these precursor creeks or nicks that were proposed to develop into creeks over time. But despite not being in the restoration plan, tidal creeks were constructed, like Mark mentioned, in the early stages of the restoration project. Oops. And this is similar to a slide that Rachel showed that, you know, despite, so these creeks were built in the early stages of the project, but by 2019, we observed these creeks filling in with sediment and vegetation. And so this dashed line in white shows you basically like the contour of those creeks and what they were designed to be. And then that really puts into perspective how choked off these tidal creeks are getting by the Spartina, mostly Spartina that's growing in the creeks. Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of maps that are ordered chronologically from 2012 to 2025. The Songs project footprint area is outlined in yellow. The symbols here that are shown on this particular map show all of the constructed tidal creeks. Circles indicate tidal creeks that have been sampled for compliance. Squares indicate tidal creeks that have not been sampled for compliance. And so, and then the date is in the top right-hand corner of each of those maps I'm going to show you. And so from 2012 to 2018, all of our tidal creeks remained intact. But by 2019, we lost 2 tidal creeks to the encroachment of salt marsh, mainly Spartina again. And so that's indicated by the red filling in of those points. And so these creeks were no longer available for future monitoring. From 2020 to 2022, we lost an additional 3 tidal creeks to Spartina encroachment that were no longer sampleable. In 2023, an additional creek was lost due to the encroachment of salt marsh plants. And in this past year, all but 2 constructed creeks remained, which led us to include, like Rachel mentioned in the prior talk, these naturally formed tidal creeks that drain these large mudflat areas. And again, it's important to note that these naturally scoured over time. They were designed to be mudflat habitat, but over time they scoured into creeks. All right, the next slide's a lot to take in. The map on the left shows you the status, whether they're filled in with Spartina or available to be sampled for each of the tidal creeks on the west and east side of the highway. So in W23 on the west side and W416 on the right side. We've labeled all the creeks so that you can translate where they're located to the table on the right. So the table on the right lists all of the constructed tidal creeks in addition to those naturally formed creeks, which we refer to as TC 9 and 10. And so based off of the aerial imagery, it appears that those 2 tidal creeks didn't scour into what could be considered tidal creeks until around 2015, but we didn't use them for compliance monitoring until this past year in 2024. And so the way that this table works is we have year on the bottom here from 2012 to 2025, And then that bottommost row indicates the number of creeks that we had to sample, which again, a full sample size according to our monitoring plan is 6 tidal creeks per wetland. And so the colors indicate the status of those creeks, whether they were sampled for compliance, shown in green, not sampled for compliance in white, or filled with some Spartina and unable to be sampled in red. And so just like the maps communicate, you see that the point here is that over time, we're losing our constructed tidal creeks due to the encroachment of Spartina in these creeks. And that another take home is that 2024 was the first year, this past year was the first year we didn't have that full sample size of 6 creeks at San Dieguito Wetlands. And in 2025, we anticipate losing those last remaining constructed tidal creeks in W23, TC4 and 5, which would mean we only have 2 tidal creeks to sample in San Dieguito Wetlands, which are those naturally formed creeks on the eastern side of the highway. Okay, sorry. So then we were wondering, okay, what is it about these creeks that's causing this habitat conversion? And so over the past few years, we've been doing multiple investigations to try to identify the mechanisms behind this pattern. And so what this figure on the left shows is a time series from 2015 to 2024 for 3 of our monitored wetlands. And this is the elevation of the lowest elevation of the sampled tidal creeks. And so again, color coding is the same as Rachel's talk. You can see that consistently San Dieguito wetland tidal creeks are higher in elevation than either of the natural wetlands that are plotted here. And their photos are a pictorial representation of basically what the plot on the left shows for each of those plotted wetlands. And so given this difference between elevation of the 3 wetlands with respect to elevation of these tidal creeks, we were wondering, well, does the hydrology and geomorphology of these tidal creeks at San Dieguito explain this evolution of them converting to salt marsh? And so to answer this question, we worked with geomorphologists and hydrologists to basically model what the creeks want to be in terms of stability wise, which is we're calling the modeled equilibrium, right? So what they did, these consultants we worked with, was they applied these hydraulic geometry relationships to various creeks within the lagoon. We're going to show you 2 examples in later slides. But to put it a little bit more simply, they use data from natural wetlands in California, 17 natural wetlands in California, to determine what is the stable creek width and depth. And that's using only data collected at the mouth of these creeks. And so the way that these models work is they consider the amount of water that an individual creek is conveying or draining. And so creeks that are draining a lot of water are going to have a different geomorphology than creeks that are not conveying a lot of water. Okay, so we're going to give you an example of a constructed creek and a naturally formed creek from San Dieguito. So what these figures are you're seeing is that we have creek width on the x-axis and elevation in feet NGVD on the y-axis. I'm going to plot the modeled equilibrium on top now. And you can see a couple things really jump out. One being that the constructed creek modeled equilibrium is higher in elevation and narrower than the naturally formed creeks. But you might remember that those naturally formed creeks are draining these large mudflat areas. And so that the amount of water they are conveying on an incoming and outgoing tide is substantially more than the constructed tidal creeks, which is what explains those differences. And next we're going to overlay data that we've collected from those creek mouths on top of this to see, okay, relative to what the creeks want to be and what is stable over time, what do they actually look like? And we conducted these surveys over 2 years in 2023 and 2024. So in these plots, 2023 is shown as the dashed dot lines in blue, and 2024 is the long dashed lines in gray. And let's just focus on the constructed creeks on the left first. So you'll notice that relative to the modeled equilibrium in black, those creeks are higher in elevation, wider, and shallower. Okay? Whereas if we look at the naturally formed creeks on the left, they appear to be narrowing and deepening and trending towards that modeled equilibrium in black. to put a little bit more succinctly, the constructed creeks appear to be accreting, and the naturally formed creeks appear to be scouring. Okay, so to summarize, we are experiencing continued loss of these constructed tidal creeks at San Dieguito, and this loss is expected to continue into this year. And this is severely compromising our ability to sample the tidal creek relative standards at San Dieguito wetlands. And given the data we've collected thus far, it appears that the creek geomorphology explains, at least in part, the conversion of these creeks to salt marsh, and that they were likely built too high, wide, and shallow, and that's contributing to the unlikelihood that they will trend towards that modeled equilibrium in the near term. And so we wanted to end with just providing our plans for 2025 as it relates specifically to the tidal creeks. So we plan to work with relevant experts to provide the California Coastal Commission with the information that they need in order to evaluate potential management options, adaptive management options. We also plan, UCSB, when I say we at UCSB also plan to review any modeling that is done to determine the optimal location, density, or design of tidal creeks at San Dieguito, constructed creeks. And then lastly, we will be working very closely with the California Coastal Commission staff and our science advisory panel to determine how to evaluate these tidal creek relative standards, given that we will only likely have 2 tidal creeks to sample in 2025. Okay, and so thank you all for coming. And with that, I'd like to bring Rachel and Mark back up to the podium to answer any questions that our audience may have. Oh.
It's Dan.
Any questions? Or were we so clear?
It was great.
Oh, Justin, go ahead. I saw your hand
I
first.
noticed your initial habitat of other was very high in 2012. Its impact.
Yeah, do you want to answer that?
Go ahead, go.
Oh,
It was your talking.
oh, okay. Sorry, so why was other habitat so high? Is that the question?
2012.
Oh, 2012. Yeah, it was prior to that. It was very high because that was before there had been any vegetation establishment, and so it was relatively slow to get established at those higher elevations.
It just doesn't meet the criteria that we have for plant habitats in the restoration plan. So we basically had subtidal, vegetated marsh, and
Mud flat.
And so other means that it's got too much vegetation to be a mud flat, and it could be too high as well. So at the beginning, it just hasn't vegetated.
Yeah, it hasn't vegetated yet.
It hasn't vegetated, basically, and so our hope was that it would eventually, and it seems like that's the case, become vegetated and turn into salt marsh.
And
So
that's
we have the criteria that Rachel mentioned was greater than 30% cover vegetation.
And so that's why we've seen it decline as the salt marsh has been going up. And again, the remaining other habitat that's there is still kind of at these higher elevations that we expect based on those criteria, because the criteria for mudflat is lower in terms of elevation. We expect it can only really convert to salt marsh to meet those criteria and not to mudflat. So it's not like we're going to be gaining mudflat from the remaining other habitat.
Right, remember that photo that had that, basically there's a salt pan with a little bit of veg, but there's no salt pan in the restoration plan. So that's why we have this other category.
Yeah, Shana.
So you might have said this, but so am I understanding correctly that the loss of tidal creeks is the key reason why the criteria isn't being met for vegetation cover, food chain, and vertebrate density? You're focusing on the loss of tidal creeks?
Well, so the loss of tidal creeks is most tightly coupled to the fish and invertebrate standards. And actually, yeah, so the invertebrate density has never been met at the lagoon. And when we compare invertebrate density in those naturally formed creeks that are much deeper and much more typical of what natural wetlands look like with respect to tidal creeks, those densities are much higher. And so we don't know, we can't say definitively that the failure of the wetland to meet invertebrate density at San Dieguito is due to the tidal creeks being too shallow and wide, but it appears that that is contributing to their low density.
There's a correlative relationship
Yeah.
between elevation and invertebrate density.
Okay. So with regards to that invertebrate density, when you measure the naturally formed creeks compared to the one downstream, there's quite a disparate gradient there. So the nutrient gradient must be huge because at the beginning, the nutrient density would be much higher compared to lower down. Is it really fair to compare that to the mile away?
So we actually see a location effect. In prior years. We've also measured there's another restoration project that's closer to the mouth, closer to those other constructed creeks, like you were saying. And we actually see the opposite in terms of looking at the deeper creeks that are on the west side that are closer to the mouth versus the deeper creeks, those naturally formed creeks that are on the eastern side of the restoration project, where we actually see more fish and invertebrates in the creeks that are closer to the mouth. I think it's more but you're right, there is a big difference, but I think that's more related to some of the geomorphology that Kat was showing.
And another, I'm curious, so the creeks that were constructed are filling up. So is that a design issue? And are the experts that designed that initially the ones that are going to assess how to correct it? Why is that? I mean, I walk over there all the time, and it's obvious that you're waiting for the tides to come in and out of these huge areas that were constructed, and of course they're going to fill up. There's no water flow through them at all. So, are the people that did that initially going to do it again? Because it didn't work.
I don't know about the second part, but the first part is they were constructed very shallow. So it's a combination of both not digging them deep enough and then having some maybe accretion going on.
Yeah.
It will be exacerbated by the presence of the cordgrass, which is going to attract, the cordgrass is going to move into this, what's essentially an elevation that corresponds to low salt marsh. So they're dug to low salt marsh elevations, the Spartina comes in and then that traps sediments, just making the problem worse.
But is that dependent on the tidal flow or the flow of water from the rain in the mountains? Because the flow that you get up north is going to be higher than what we get down here. And the mouth of this lagoon is pretty narrow compared to what it was before the highway was put in, as an example.
I think the lagoon is much more sensitive to the tidal flow because the rain inputs for the region are relatively low. That said, like sediment inputs are largely from freshwater flows, right? So, but the sediment trapping that Mark's talking about, that's like exacerbated by the presence of the Spartina and is a little bit. I guess is your question more of like, is it tidal flow that could scour them? Is that what you're asking versus rain?
Yeah, well, we don't have that much coming from the mountains. So just episodically.
It's more of a biological response to the elevation of the creek that's causing the issue. Yeah.
Right, and so also the creeks drain a catchment, an area, and it remains to be determined whether that area is sufficient to keep the creeks deep enough.
Right.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, recently we've had major sand replenishment projects in Long Beach and Encinitas, and you can see it at Dog Beach. And I'm interested, are you tracking that at all and its impact of the lagoon? Can you give us some insight? What would be the risk to the lagoon if the mouth were to close? And how quickly would we be in trouble? My understanding is San Diego closed just in the last couple of days.
Yeah, Hani Alani has been the lead on a lot of the beach nourishment impacts on the lagoon, so he's the best person to speak to that.
Thank you very much. So this question is actually it's an ongoing question. As you know, the lagoon being designed and
Hani, can you use the microphone?
Thank you. And the lagoon being stayed open to 2008 until the present time, right? With minimum clearance from us to maintain the lagoon in place, which is the middle of the shine. The fact that the sand being put north of the beach, right? encroachment on the lagoon area mitigated to the south. The lagoon, because it's strong, tide basin in the lagoon was very good, improved by WQ. Thank you. Yes, sir. And improved by
Whoa, there you go.
now we can hear. Good, but the environment having the good by 19, which is good, right? Makes the lagoon survive the sand. The lagoon now is flat. Yeah.
We're gonna get you.
Yeah.
There's the Dan. Is that right?
Talk into this.
It's better now, right? Okay, so lagoon now is flushing, right? Still flushing till now. The question comes is, how long stay flushing, right? I think for time being, it's hard questions to answer because it is in random environments. It depends on what's going on by waves, by rains, by tides, right? But we feel that the flushing enough for time being that we need to keep monitoring a little bit more and before we decide to take any actions regarding it, right? And it's dynamic, it's meandering all over the place, right? You can watch it one day in one place, you come next day, it's completely different place, right? So it's meandering around, it's moving, still have tidal flushing is going on strong, right? The intrusion of the sand happened to the lagoon is too much, right? It's too much. 66,000 cubic yards of the sand being trapped near the inlet area, right? So even so, our lagoon is doing well, it's flushing, right? It's keep going to when, we don't know. We have to look carefully and take the right decision at the right time.
I'm not a scientist, but my understanding is that things are at risk within as short as 3 to 6 days. If there's a closure, is that right? And how do we manage that?
For like the biology, how long can the inlet be closed before the biology responds?
No, it takes time. There are quite a lot of tides exchange for time being between the ocean and the lagoon. So keeping the water quality in good. If the lagoon is closed, your question is, if the lagoon closed, how long it take for the water quality to get bad, right? It's going to take about, from the various experience we had in this lagoon and the other lagoons similar to the area, it's going to take about maybe 3 weeks before it's getting worse, right? And you can see fish kill, in the lagoon and get deteriorated. A couple of weeks will be maybe fine, would be okay, right? But perhaps after that, 3 weeks is going to be an issue.
But it can happen though quickly, like you said.
It
And
can,
depending on if there's any like overtopping of water or whatever, but if the inlet is plugged up and you have a drop in DO and you have inputs of nutrients and so forth from the watershed, the dissolved oxygen can drop pretty quickly.
So when the sand was dredged off the deposit from the river offshore, that destroyed a lot of the biology living on the bottom, didn't it? And if that's true, did that affect the life forms that migrated into the river? When I talked to the
there are sand migrated to the lagoon channels, right? But most of the sand being trapped in the inlet area west of Highway 101. Okay, so there are small. Small comparing to what we have west of Highway 101. Small amount of the sand migrated east of the Highway 101. It's not large and also did not cross the railroad bridge, right? Did not cross the railroad bridge. And actually we are very careful that no sand been crossing the railroad bridge because mainly getting rid of this sand will be much bigger process than if the sand be trapped west of the railroad bridge.
So I was just curious though, I watched them dredging the sand at the river mouth. That must be eco-terror for the organisms that live there. I'm just asking the biological question is, did that destruction out there affect the biology of the lagoon itself, is what I'm trying to.
Okay, so the inlet maintenance, we're not monitoring the inlet per se.
Right.
If you're talking about the sandy beach in front of it, or
Yes, I'm wondering about the consequences of dredging, which was destructive to the organisms at the river mouth. Did that affect the biology of what you're studying?
Okay,
Yeah,
It
so
was-
most of all of our sampling sites are further upstream, and comparing it to priors, looking at all of those annual time series, we don't see a
Okay.
difference for us.
And it's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
The motivation of inlet maintenance is to make sure that the biology in the lagoon remains
Mhm.
healthy and intact.
Yeah.
And so it's actually the opposite.
This wasn't inlet maintenance. This
Oh.
wasn't inflow maintenance. This was taking sand out to put it on the beach up in Oceanside.
Oh, okay,
And then the
that's separate
lagoon
from
brings all that sand down
Yeah.
and closes it. So
oh,
Yeah,
I'm
it's not-
surprised, you know.
Yeah.
okay, you mean that taking the sand from the borough area to move it to the beach?
Yeah.
Yes, it has some impacts, has been
Yeah.
studied
Say so.
by Sandag, right?
Yeah.
And then the big, huge area being dredged, right? It does have long time impacts, but this been studied by Sandag, right? And it does have impacts on the marine biology of the area.
Be the money trail on that.
Yeah.
yeah, that's not something that we're involved in.
Yeah, it's not
That's
part of this, yeah, it's not related to this project anyway. It doesn't impact the biology of San Dieguito Lagoon anyway. I mean, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, Aaron,
Figure
I have
out-
a question for Captain.
Yes, sir.
Back to the accretion and the channels.
Mhm.
I'm curious, have you thought about or analyzed where the sediment that's filling in the channels is coming from? Is it, I mean, it's likely not the river.
Are you talking about the creeks?
Yeah, inside of creeks, where the actual sediment that's filling the creeks in, where's that coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. It's not river sediment flow that's clogging the creeks. We haven't looked at the source of that sediment, but there is evidence that there has been scour in other parts of the wetland, and so it's sort of like a zero, and it's moving somewhere. It's not just coming out of nowhere, right? And so it could be that the areas that are scouring are being deposited, but that's something we haven't looked at yet. That's something that we
Like, the marsh play.
marsh plain or in the frequently flooded mudflat that the TC 9 and 10 drain. We have seen those deepening over time. That sediment's got to go somewhere. There is some evidence that a lot of it's getting deposited on the mudflat itself, but we haven't actually sourced where that sediment is coming from. That's a great question.
It's kind of interesting to go through Google Earth images. You've probably done that. And yeah, it's pretty fascinating actually. But as far as the creeks that we're talking about, they were dug fairly shallow. That excavation is probably the biggest issue. It's just we're saying and we're measuring some changes in elevation that seem to be accretion.
Sure.
But we don't really know where those sediments are coming from.
Right. Could it have been, like, from some of the initial excavations, from the banks, from the.
I mean, just widening potentially.
Even
Like the
the
berm.
slopes surrounding
Yeah.
excavations. Before they were fully vegetated, and that the accretion had already started. But the Spartine hadn't moved in yet.
Yeah, I don't think we can answer that question because they weren't looking at it back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question is, based on your findings, does this mean that something needs to be done, say there's only 2 tidal creeks remaining? Or is it possible that it's just accepted that this is a different situation that was man-made? And we're never gonna meet these criteria, so we just maybe let it slide? I mean, I don't really know. Any idea? And who would fix it?
That might be
Yeah.
a staff question.
Yeah, maybe we'll defer to the CCC staff person here, Rachel Pausch is here to answer more policy questions.
Hi, I'm with the Coastal Commission. My name's Rachel Pausch. The permit conditions are clear to restore a functioning wetland with natural processes. And so we've had these criteria and we've had them for a long time. I think we've been waiting the past year to see what would the impacts from the new projects in that area would do before we tried to settle on a remediation strategy or even pursue further studies that might answer, is this really the equilibrium for this system? So I think we're open to the idea that perhaps the constructed creeks are not going to be persisting all of them into time, but I think that's the goal for this next year of work, is to get some more information about where the equilibrium might be and what we think is necessary for that system to be functioning.
Did you have a follow-up, Steve, to that?
Yeah, I do. And I guess I have opinions about adaptive management, and I'm thinking, and you alluded to this, the 22nd Ag restoration, and we've had discussions about them being over excavated and so forth, but they have basically maintained these tidal creeks, and as you pointed out, they have a lot of fish and vertebrates and so forth, and so I think it's worth examining potential adaptive management strategies to basically go in there and dig out these creeks. And I think it should be on the table to kind of look at that.
Yeah, and that was why one of our plans for 2025 was to review any modeling that's done to determine how many, where, what's the design of creeks if we do consider re-excavating creeks and things like that. It needs to be done very thoughtfully and in a way that's going to be self-sustaining, so this doesn't require regular intervention.
Right. The idea is to collect information that Coastal Commission staff can use in their policies.
Yes.
Seems like all the tidal creeks, even the naturally occurring ones on site, don't have spartina on it.
They do.
Because none of not in
Penasquitos
or your
other
reference, because there's no spartina.
Oh, right.
Essentially, any of those lagoons.
Right.
So obviously, and you alluded to the fact that spartina growing in is causing more accretion and stuff. So I'm just wondering, obviously they're more in size, they're not gonna have as much low marsh for the spartina to grow on, but we all know spartina is a really good thing because it's where the rails are. So I'm just wondering how that.
Well, in prior years, we used Tijuana as a reference site, and Tijuana has, lush, wonderful stands of spartina. And so we actually did some surveys trying to compare elevations of spartina at our lagoon versus Tijuana. And also we looked at some of the constructed creeks at San Alejo as well that don't have salt marsh encroachment, but also have, those stands of spartina. And another kind of interesting component of that, in addition to the fact that our tidal creeks are higher, it's also, we've found that the elevation range of spartina at San Dieguito also happens to be wider. So it's kind of like a 1-2 punch of the creeks are higher and spartina can go lower for some reason at San Dieguito. So it's kind of those two things together have contributed, I think, to the exacerbation of the problem that we have. But yes, there's other, areas with tidal creeks in the area that have spartina adjacent.
And I think that's partly because of the median, because I have another my site that's in the back of Hedionda. The spartina grows from 1 to 4.
Interesting
elevation.
Yeah, it really
And
has.
it's because it's getting muted and stuff back there and not having as big a tidal range maybe. But
interesting, because I feel like it's all connected, right? Tidal inundation is also part of it.
Where it is, and
a
lot of that's been some of my arguments for Magoo and Carpinteria that are right next to the mouth, where we're a mile inland. For both yours and Caltrans one on the other side, so it's things are different.
The other thing is that on the creeks that Rachel's talking about that have spartina on the edge, like San Alejo and TJ or Tijuana, the slope and the steepness of those creeks is much, much greater. And that's how TC 9 and 10, the naturally formed creeks are. It's really steep. Our staff are in there up to their chests.
Pretty.
And so I think that also makes a difference, because if just like a typical creek would be in a natural wetland, those steep sides would prevent the spartina from moving in. But if it's really nice and gradual and you're spartina on the edge, well, you'll just keep moving clonally into the creek, right? So I think slope and steepness of the creeks is a huge component of.
But that's a function of flow, right?
That's a function of design. Design of the restoration.
If you make a creek as wide as this house and you put 1 cc a day through it, it's gonna disappear, no matter how deep you dig it.
Well, I think, but if your creek is low enough in elevation and gets inundated with every single tide, it should sustain itself, but they're too high as well. So
depending on the tidal flow.
It's all connected. It's tidal flow, creek design, and the actual vegetation.
Yeah.
Following on that, I want to hear your comments on sea level rise projections. I know the Ocean Protection Council has reduced them somewhat, but if they're on the hook for 32 years to meet these criteria, we're going to see sea level rise. We don't have a lot of room to expand the lagoon. Are we going to see habitat conversion? And is this going to impede their ability to meet the standards over time? And what do we do about it?
Yeah, so I'll defer to Rachel on that.
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
Do you wanna add any?
Well, sure. I'll just say that yes, probably there's going to be observed changes in sort of sisters projects to the SONGS project, like the Channelside, formerly Poseidon project. They've incorporated sea level rise into their monitoring plan by creating a shifting baseline that's based off of sea level rise projections. And so there might be capacity for us to explore that. That's like on our to-do list for the near term to figure out those changes with like additional studies. Because our permit was written before sea level rise was considered a component of these projects. And so that's something that we're gonna have to do in the coming years. Yeah.
Are you seeing yet anything that you attribute to sea level rise? No.
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
No, you pretty much said, I mean, that's the idea with the reference sites too, is that we can obviously there's differences between sites, but having those relative standards that allows for comparison within the same time frame. I'll also say we're really happy that we have the issue of accretion and we're getting more vegetation versus trending the other way with more mud flat, less vegetation, scouring everywhere. So I'm glad to see the trajectory, even though it hasn't made the brackets that we put out, you know, it seems to be going in a more resilient direction.
Any other questions?
Great questions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you guys for coming.
Yeah.